We are Heather and Paul Christie.
And for over 12 years, we've worked with executives and entrepreneurs to accelerate change in every aspect of their business.
Because we are in the fastest paced business environment that anyone has ever seen before.
So join us for the Evolve to Win show. Hi, and welcome to another Evolve to Win show with Heather and Paul.
If you are looking to increase your influence with anyone, we're going to share with you today a model that we've developed over the years that essentially is a model. It's called dynamic adaptation, but it is in theory what I learned from some of the best back in my lobbying days. So we've taken the liberty of creating this model for you, and we're going to take you step by step through each part of this process. And one of the things that I can tell you is that in all the years that I have spent, whether it was in my legal career as a lobbyist or in business, the best of the best leaders have really learned how to master this concept called dynamic adaptation.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, and then one of the parts we're going to talk about has made a massive impact in my life. And we're going to go through that, and then I'll tell a little story about that.
Oh, good. I don't even know what story you're going to tell, but I can't wait to hear it. Let me give you the theory in a nutshell. Dynamic adaptation essentially suggests that every situation that you encounter is dynamic. It's unique. It's different. It's fluid. So every circumstance, every situation is dynamic. And because of that, it requires you to adapt your style to get the best results out of the circumstance.
So what are you talking about when you say style?
Okay. So when I use the word style,
yes.
I'm talking about
how I look today style.
No, but you do look really nice today. Let me just say that. No, I'm really talking about the way that we behave, right? It's our observable behavior, meaning are you a super fast-paced person or are you more slow-paced? Are you someone who's very people-oriented or are you someone who's really not so interested in people? You're just more interested in getting things done.
Yeah.
Okay, you may have learned about these different styles in the past. Either maybe you've taken an assessment in the past, a DISC assessment, an assessment with colors, with birds, with animals, but essentially it's a 4-part assessment that really tells you how you're behaving towards others, and I think even more importantly, how you're perceived by others. Now, what's true for us human beings is that we're habitual beings.
Yes.
And in the last episode, I shared this model with you called the stick person figure that I got from Bob Proctor years ago.
Yeah.
And one of the points that I was making in that is the fact that, we are habitual human beings. About 95% of the time, we are acting habitually, meaning we're just being who we're being without actually consciously thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's also the habits are about like what we're thinking, like just the repetitive nonsense that goes on of our day, because I recognize that I am not in conscious thought most of the time. Most of the time I'm not in conscious thought, meaning I am not actively thinking and putting my brain to work on solving problems and things like that because it's difficult.
Well,
right?
and I think we probably need to even back up and describe what this whole concept is called conscious thought, because most people think they're thinking all day long. And the reality is you're not thinking. You have this, as Paul was saying, like this looped thinking that's going on. That's just a habitual way of thinking because.
And it kind of drives me crazy. It's sometimes, and I know a lot of it too. And one of the keys is, if you're dehydrated, your brain will get into a loop even more often. So if you keep having that repetitive thought, or you thinking of that song that's in your head
that you can't get out of your head, yes.
Right? You got to drink some water. But, so I know that, but so I have these thoughts and I say, well, how can I just stop thinking this same thought over and over and over? And it's almost like you have to distract yourself, but it is putting yourself in conscious thought.
Yes.
As opposed to unconscious.
Yeah, so your
unconscious, subconscious.
Both of them work. So yeah, your subconscious mind pretty much rules your world. And that also means that your subconscious mind is really in charge of your behavior, the style that you show, the behavior that shows up for other people. Now, in this model, dynamic adaptation, at the core, the first and most important aspect of this model is self-awareness. All right, so if I were to, I'm just going to use the,
right here.
Oh, you got one there? No, there's one.
Okay.
So if this side of the model is self-awareness, we're going to label that self-awareness.
I better use this one. This one's better.
Okay. They can see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually it looks pretty good.
I think it's pretty good.
Okay, well,
Okay, so we've got a circle that I just drew up there that says self-awareness. This is the foundation of this principle, is that you've really got to understand you better than you do right now. And when I see that, I know that every single one of you listening, you're at a different level of your self-awareness, right? We're all at different levels. If you had asked me 10 years ago how I was doing at self-awareness, I would have told you, oh my gosh, I was rocking it, because I had spent so much effort just over, maybe a 5-year period since 2001, really understanding myself, like peeling back the layers and getting to know me. So I really felt like I was doing extremely well at self-awareness. But I want you to remember, you don't know what you don't know. And for me, that certainly was the case, and I know will be the case for the rest of my life, because self-awareness is a constant evolution. It's an everyday if you allow it to be, but certainly every single year you should know so much more about yourself than you did the year before.
Right. And so the reason why we're talking about self-awareness is because as a great leader, if you're going to lead people, you really need to understand who you are. So if you think about some of the, I'm going to go kind of on the opposite side of this, some of the people that you've had as leaders that weren't great leaders, a lot of them are not self-aware. They do not really understand who they are. So they're either trying to manipulate people or they're overpowering people. They don't really understand themselves. So it makes it so much difficult for them to understand others.
That's right. And if you don't understand yourself extremely well, or let's take, for example, the leaders, the bad leaders that you just talked about, those who are not self-aware are also unaware of the impact that they have on others, like completely unaware. And here's what the truth is. Most people will never actually tell you honestly what the impact is that you have on them if it's negative. So those who are lacking self-awareness are, oh my gosh, you are doing yourself such a huge disservice. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we come across in working with leaders at all different levels is that those who are not self-aware actually think that they are, and they have a blind spot.
Okay.
Right? That's true most of the time. They think they know themselves, but they are completely unaware of the impact that their actions have on others.
So let's give some examples of how somebody, if they're not really self-aware, because if you're listening to this, you're saying, well, I feel like I'm pretty self-aware. I know who I am, but what are some examples of somebody who's maybe not as self-aware?
Well, typically those who are not as self-aware will have an issue that shows up for them with those around them. Remember, everyone around us is a mirror for us. They're a reflection of how we behave. And so usually we get brought in to work with an executive because they're having some sort of challenge and some sort of blind spot. They're having a negative impact in some way, usually on the relational side. They're typically extremely talented and skilled, and they know what they're doing within their role.
Yeah.
But their issue tends to be an interpersonal relationship issue, a communication issue.
Right.
So give you an example. Maybe they talk too much. Okay.
Yeah.
This is an awareness that those who have a certain style of being outgoing and optimistic, there's so many strengths that go along with this style, but one of the major limitations is you spend more time talking than listening. And we all know that great leaders listen more than talk. And so the thing is, this person would tell you, oh yeah, I'm a talker. I could talk and talk and talk.
Right.
And so they think they have the awareness of themselves being a talker, but they really don't understand how negatively it's impacting other people.
Right.
I mean, there was one woman that I worked with who was known to be this talker, and there was kind of a running joke in the office that if you wanted to get out of the office by 5 or 6 o'clock, you couldn't meet with her anytime after 2. So, like what is happening around you and the impact you have on other people, the last thing you want to do is become a brunt of someone's jokes, right?
Yeah. So then, kind of the opposite of that is, the driver. So the guy or the gal that's like a hammer that's looking for the nail, is absolutely driving it, thinks that driving with force, brute force, is the way to go, right? So I've had leaders, I've had people that I've worked for that they're like, and you know what? And it works for some people. Like some people fall in line for that. The problem is they see it work once and then they think that it's going to work for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So they believe that their style of leadership is just with brute force.
Mm-hmm.
But they have so many people leave the organization, and I watched it happen in firsthand. How many people left the organization because they couldn't deal with that particular person?
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I believe, was that they just weren't self-aware enough that they had good people. They just were trying the same way to lead people every time. And a lot of that was just not understanding who they are.
And I think when you say they were trying to lead people the same way, I think what's most likely happening there is they're just leading people the same way because they're not self-aware enough to consciously shift who they're being based on what's needed in the situation.
Right.
They're not using dynamic adaptation.
Uh-huh.
So we could go on and give a number of different examples about different types of leadership where, again, it's like this subconscious role plays out for us. And we're usually not thinking about it, which means we are almost always coming to any relationship, any conversation. And look, I don't care if it's at work and you're in a leadership position, or even if it's at home and how you are with your spouse or how you are with your kids. The way you do anything is the way you do everything, unless you're actually consciously choosing. And that's what dynamic adaptation requires. So if we look at the second piece of this model, is awareness of others. And
so if you're just joining us now, we're talking about dynamic adaptation. The first part of it is self-awareness. So we went over some examples of self-awareness and where there are opportunities where most people who are leading others that are not at the top of their game right now are still challenged by not even understanding who they are as a person.
And yet they think they know who they are. So that's really one of the biggest things that can hold you back there with self-awareness, is that you've learned a bit, you've studied a bit. Like I was saying, 10 years ago, I thought I was at the top of my game at self-awareness. But if I look at where I am now compared with where I was 10 years ago, it's night and day. I had no idea what I didn't know back then.
Yeah.
And yet if you asked me, I would have thought I was really self-aware because of the work I'd done. So again, the concept of self-awareness is that it's a constant evolution. It's a constant growth. And you may think that you're incredibly self-aware because you've done some work. And if you have, then you've already, like if you've done any work, you're already ahead of the rest of the population, because there are many people who will do no work, right?
Yep.
But the amount of time that you invest and the effort that you invest in really understanding who you are and the impact you have on other people, and really, really getting in tune with that, it's really an opportunity for everyone. Even some of the best leaders I've worked with are still looking to grow.
So now you drew these.
I drew this. So the second piece of it is awareness of others. You know, once you understand who you are, and especially who you are habitually, because you've got some mad strengths that go with that, but you're always also going to have some limitations and some challenges, and we call them blockers. And you know when you've gotten caught in that blocker zone. Every one of you knows that you're the one holding you back, right? Those are your blockers. So are you truly aware of those blockers? And it's not enough to know that you have them. You also have to know what to do with them. You have to know why you have them in order to really, really do away with them, right? Okay, so when you're thinking about awareness of others, you know, this one is really interesting as well, because once you start to study human behavior, when you really start to understand and know how to analyze it, it is such a cool trick to know, right? It's great to have that toolbox. I mean,
I think one of the reasons is because it's not as complicated as you think it is.
It's not that hard.
Like when you use the 4 quadrants of like a disc or Myers-Briggs, or it's very similar to, it's very easy to start to distinguish those people. And you see them all the time, and you see them in movies, you read it in books, in any stories, they distinguish those types of behavioral styles. So you see them, but until you're aware and you understand what those are, it's really, once you do, it's really easy to start figuring out what people want and what they need from you.
Yes. And that's a great place where I can share with you, back when I was practicing as a lobbyist. So I was a lawyer who practiced in a practice area called legislative and regulatory law. And I represented a Fortune 100, actually it was a Fortune 40 company at the time. basically globally in an international effort. And so in my role, I would have to fly to different state capitals. I would be up in our office in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill, European Union, all over the globe, even in areas like we went to Asia as well. So there were times where, we weren't even speaking the same language, right, as some of the people we were working with. But for the most part, we were in America. And I did not have access to a model that allowed me to really understand this dynamic adaptation. So what I did is I just watched the other lobbyists who I worked with. We would hire someone. Let's say I had to fly out to Hawaii, which we did a number of times. I had to fly out to Hawaii because our issue showed up there. We would hire local counsel in Hawaii. They had all the relationships. And then we would go and meet with them, and we would work out strategy, and they would bring us to all these meetings. So I would watch how they interacted with every single elected official. Mm-hmm. And I would just I would notice that there were different ways, there were different dynamics. Sometimes they'd be really friendly, and other times they would get straight to business. And I was just taking it all in, but I didn't really understand it because no one had shown me a model up until that point. So like you're saying, when you learn this 4-part model, now you did mention Myers-Briggs as well, which is a great assessment. But I think Myers-Briggs is much more difficult to understand because there are so many different dimensions to it. That's why I prefer when we train, we use the DISC model. So just a 4-part model. You're either someone who's dominant, you're someone who's an influencer, you're someone who's supportive, or you're someone who is conscientious. So there's those 4 styles. Once I finally understood what those 4 primary styles were, then I started studying, well, how do I figure this out? Because most people don't know what style they are. So it's not like you can ask them directly. But once you understand the different styles, you have the ability now to start to figure out who someone is. And then when you understand what every style wants and needs in terms of communication, this is what we're talking about with awareness of others.
And you know what's insane is this is not taught in school, which is really unbelievable. Like, to be able to understand people, like if we want to resolve a lot of the bullying issues in grade schools and high schools and the social media bullying and all of this stuff of interacting with people, and in kids, it's even more dramatic, right? You're going to see like the height, and you're going to see that D dominant or influencer, like either come out as a real good person or they're going to come out as somewhat of a bully. All of this could be understood in the context of DISC if they taught it in school.
It's really true.
Yeah, I mean,
because
you would be able to say the reason this kid is acting the way that they do, maybe there's some underlying issues that go along with it, but a lot of it is really based on their behavioral style and the things that they need and want. And who do they look for? They look for people who are different from them to be able to go after. So not about bullying or anything, but it's just about the idea that this is so like incredibly helpful as not only as an adult, but if a kid understood this, it would just be amazing.
I know. So I learned it first in 2001 when my law firm brought this training in.
Yeah.
And it blew my mind that it had been something that I had learned over time. And so I sort of knew, but when I found a model I could use so that I could understand other people, it was incredible. Now, back then I had I think it was maybe a couple hours of training, and that was it. And then I didn't have anything for a few years after that.
Right.
So, there is, and since then, we've not only become certified practitioners of a number of different assessments that have everything to do with self-awareness, awareness of others, but, what we've learned about ourselves, what we've learned about the impact that we have on others is just extraordinary. So again, the second piece is really incredible. But that's not where it ends. The dynamic adaptation is actually in the middle here. And that's where because of what you understand about yourself and because of what you understand about others, you know exactly how to adapt your style for the highest level of communication and rapport. So let me just say it to you this way. Have you ever had it happen before where you're talking with someone and they're that high dominant style. They're impatient, they're fast moving, they look like they're almost annoyed, they've got something better to do. And there's a reaction that you might have to that person who's extremely dominant, maybe aggressive, possibly just assertive, but there's a reaction that you have there. Now, if you have someone who's very dominant talking to someone else who's very dominant, that could go okay because they don't need to soften so much. It could also go like this, but that typically can go okay. They can be direct, blunt, fast, bullet point, go, and everybody's fine.
Yeah.
But if you have someone who's really dominant, who's in conversation with someone, let's say, who's a high level supporter, someone who's more of a people person, someone who's patient, someone who's that's you. Although sometimes it doesn't show up like that, does it? But if you had someone like that who was very fast, impatient, talking to someone who was slower paced, reserved, more patient, they're going to feel like they just got run over by a steamroller. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it's just...
Well, and this is what we're talking about. I mean, in the beginning, it's what the whole point of dynamic adaptation is that understanding yourself first, understanding others, bringing those two together and being able to immediately recognize who you are speaking to and who you need to either bring the energy up with, you need to talk faster with, you need to slow down, you need to match a little bit with their pace and with the way that they're speaking, with the things that they want to hear. I can tell, I played tennis this morning with a high C, analytical type, conscientious type of person, very, very wants to know all the details and everything. And I knew when I was talking to him about tennis and stuff, I just had to slow down the pace. I had to be much more conscious of connecting with him with details of things to do. We were just talking about how we were going to play the game together, and it works great. It really does. So it's immediately understanding who you're speaking with, and then you start to groove at the same kind of wavelength, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are rules about this, quite honestly. All the different styles have their different rules, their different preferences. If you don't really fully understand this, meaning like you've studied this and you know exactly what these different styles are about, how they're motivated, how they like to be communicated with, how to coach them, how to motivate them. Like if you don't understand it at this level, think about the opportunity, because here's what's so. When you don't know this, when you haven't studied it, most people will treat other people, they'll think of other people as they are, not as the other person is. So let me say that in a way that maybe makes more sense.
Okay.
If I don't know better, I think of you as I am, not as you are.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't recognize that you're not thinking the way I'm thinking. I don't recognize that you don't have the same natural energy level as I do.
Right.
And it's the biggest mistake people make in communication is thinking that somebody wants to communicate the same way that you do.
Right.
It's almost never true. So you might get lucky now and then, but if you're just running around being who you are without understanding this concept of dynamic adaptation, without getting into this sweet spot in the middle of this model, you are not connecting as much as you could be, which means that you don't have the rapport that you could have with that other person. That also means that you have limited access to influence, right? Where does influence come from? At its core, it comes from trust. And you trust somebody because they respect you. Now, I know that some of you are thinking, if I'm constantly changing who I'm being, that's totally inauthentic and possibly even manipulative. And there's a massive distinction between manipulation and dynamic adaptation, right? Because if I'm manipulating someone, I'm changing who I'm being in order to get something I want, which is very different from dynamic adaptation, where I go into a situation, I start to understand who you are, what your behavioral style is, what your wants and needs are for communication, for motivation, accountability, all of that. And I adapt who I'm being out of respect for who you are and what you need. That's very, very different. And you think about it. If you are so present in the moment, because it absolutely requires you to be present.
Yeah.
If you're so present that you can understand who someone else is and how they want to be communicated with, they are going to feel like you care. they're going to feel very special, right?
Right. And so, and just to kind of wrap this up, so we have a lot of clients that work with us, and the leaders, whether it's the HR team or the leader or the president of the company, will call us and say they want us to come in and do basically a DISC training for them, a dynamic adaptation training for them. And we either do that by Zoom or we do it live, depending on where they are. And what happens is when their team is taught how to, because a lot of times they're calling us because there's some pain point, right? There's some issue. Either people are not getting along with each other, or they're just not collaborating better or good together, or whatever is happening. But what happens is they call us and we do the training for them. And usually we'll do follow-ups, but just that initial training of doing the assessment with them and then doing the training, it is like a total aha moment for most of them. They've never been taught this before, or if they have, they say they have, but they don't remember like any ongoing training of it. And so they kind of understand it, but they've never really put it to use. And what we have them do is go through the exercises and make them really practice through, like, and one of the best exercises we do is the one, how do you like to be communicated with? And most people, like what Heather was saying about how we communicate to people, pretty much how we feel that we should be communicated. So I'll go around communicating to people how I think everybody should be. But the fact is that everybody's different. And in one of the exercises, we talk to them and we have them go through and list off and talk to other people on their team about how they actually want to be communicated to, which is usually completely different from how they are being communicated right now.
Totally.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. And it made me think, this morning I was on the tennis courts and I was asking one of my my teammate, actually, I said, all right, we're doing a podcast today. Tell me, are there any challenges that you're having currently that I could bring into this podcast? Because I know that, if I hear from somebody, just here's what's going on in my world right now, there's a lot of other people who probably have that same thing going on. Her thing was, my 15-year-old daughter. And they thought for sure that would be a stumper for me because we don't have kids of our own. But the reality is it's not actually a stumper, because it really still is all about who that person is and how they need to be communicated with. So I would suggest, again, not just in business, but also in your personal world, do you really, truly understand your children's behavioral styles? And you might say to yourself, oh yeah, of course, I know my kids backward and forward, and I can tell you what they're going to say. I know what they're going to do. And yet, do you understand what's underneath that? Do you understand why they do that? Because every one of those 4 styles that we talked about comes about because of an underlying emotion. And if you don't know what the emotion is that's underlying your children's every moves, then you can't possibly parent them in a way that totally sticks with them, right? So when you think about this dynamic adaptation model, move it into your personal world. I know we have, certainly not only with each other, but with the students that we've hosted as well, right? We've had students that we've hosted, exchange students from Japan, from China, and from Pulaski, Wisconsin. I know that fits right in, right? Completely different styles, all 3 of them. And if we tried to host parent them each in the same way, and you guys know this who are parents, you can't parent 2 different children in the same way, right? But do you understand what's beneath it? Because once you do, and you can help them understand why they feel the way they do, that's when it's magic. They understand for the first time why they do what they do. Because it's not enough to know what you do. It's more important to know why you do it, right? Okay, so for this session, just to wrap up, we're talking about dynamic adaptation. We're talking about the skills that every awesome leader has tapped into and really gotten good at. It's the fact that they understand themselves. And by the way, when you think about strengths, or when you think about self-awareness, I also want you to think about strengths and weaknesses. There have been so many great books written about strengths and weaknesses. And I think as much as you may be aware of your strengths, most people who I've worked with, and these are people at senior leadership levels, so they've gotten there because of self-awareness, right, and dynamic adaptation. But most people that I work with still are not at a level where they understand their strengths so well that they're intentionally tapping into them. So that's an opportunity, I think, for all of us, right? So understanding yourself, understanding others, once you have the awareness that other people are different from you, then you have to say, okay, based on those differences, how do I best lead them? How do I best communicate with them? How do I best hold them accountable? Do you know that you hold every style accountable in a different way? How do I go through conflict with them? Because there are 3 out of 4 styles who are not big on conflict. So you're probably not going to hear from them. So it's really understanding this and adapting. And the last thing I'll say is when you look at this rectangle that I put behind my model, the rectangle really is about the culture of the environment that you're in, right? So you think about within different organizations, you will find very different cultures. And let's say that you've brought in a new hire from a different organization, and they're going to have culture shock at first, and they have to try to figure out this whole process with this, overview of the culture that they're in, which also requires a certain level of adaptation.
And this is the whole like onboarding. So think of yourself when you've walked into a new organization and you've start meeting the people, you've gone through the HR department, they've given some papers to fill out, all that stuff, but now you're dunked into the culture of the company and you're kind of just feeling it out, seeing what people are. Are people gossipy or are they like fun, outgoing? What is the culture of the organization? Then understanding yourself and then starting to understand who you are and trying to really adapt to have the most influence in that organization.
That's right. So we spent most of today talking about self-awareness, and yet we have not gotten into some of the details about really understanding more. If we get some feedback from you that you guys want to go deeper into this, we're happy to share that 4-part DISC model and help you really understand not only your DISC style. Many of you know that. Many of you have taken an assessment in the past and you can say, oh, I'm a DI or I'm an SC. But do you know the emotions that drive your behavior? Most people are not aware that this is all based on emotion. And do you also know the techniques for how you become aware of it in the moment so that you can make that adaptation? So I hope you enjoyed the show today. If you know someone else who needs to hear this, please feel free to share it and leave us a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you know about your style. What is it that you know about your style? What more do you need to know to take dynamic adaptation to the next level? You can always catch this on our YouTube channel as well if you search on Heather Christie, not the rock star, because I do have a Heather Christie out there who's the rock star. I think I'm the next one down. So check us out on YouTube. And thanks for tuning in today.
Have a great day.